Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. I am Dr. Nnamdi Bokwe, Director of Knowledge and Thought Leadership at Convergence. We're here today to present to you our annual State of Blended Finance Report, Climate Edition. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. This event is being recorded, and we will share that recording with you all. As we begin, we ask that you rename yourself and display your name and organization so we know who is on the call and who we're interacting with. We will have two Q&A sessions, so please utilize the Q&A function to pose your questions during those sessions. And finally, if you're looking for the report, it is currently available for download on our resource page at www.convergence.finance/resource. Quick overview for the agenda. 90 minutes together today, so we have a full schedule and we'll try and get everyone out of here on time. I'll kick things off with some opening remarks about this year's report. Then I'll turn it over to the authors of the report, the content team, to present key findings. Following that presentation, we'll open up the floor for questions. And once we conclude the Q&A session, we do have a fantastic panel discussion featuring three incredible expert voices from the community of blended finance. Again, after the panel discussion, you will have an opportunity to pose questions to our panelists. And finally, we will wrap things up with some closing remarks from our CEO, Joan Larea. Okay, let's get started. So this has been a landmark year for several reasons. You'll hear some of the numbers and trends throughout today's presentation, but specifically for Convergence, 2024 marks the first time we published two State of Blended Finance reports, one in the spring for the overall market and one in the fall for climate. These reports each evaluate the state of blended finance industry by adding transactions to our historical deals database and by engaging a series of key expert interviews. Now, climate continues to be a major driver of blended finance. Last year, we noted that financing levels were not moving in the right direction. But as we highlighted in the spring edition, there has been a shift, and the market has reached a 5-year high. This trend is perhaps most pronounced when looking at climate deals, as we're excited to report that climate blended finance saw its highest ever financing total this past year. And even more encouraging is that this is not reflective of a spike in donor capital. Rather, our data shows that private sector capital increase of 200%. We're always talking about mobilization and mobilizing the private sector, so I'll say it again. Our data shows private sector capital increase of 200%. So what does this tell us? Well, for one thing, it tells us that catalytic capital is being used more effectively, more efficiently to mobilize this level of activity. And the level of activity is critically important. What we're witnessing is very large-scale deals come to the market. Now, I've said this before, and I'll once again borrow some words from our CEO, Joan, that I think captures this phenomenon beautifully. After having watched the horizon for a single tail fin that would signal change, we suddenly saw an entire pod of whales breach the surface. We believe this is a critical inflection point. Billion-dollar deals are no longer one-offs. It's a signal, and it signals replication, it signals scale, and it signals that we can, in fact, consistently blend billions. So in addition to other trends in market activity that you'll hear, this year's report also highlights a few things. First, the spillover effect of blended finance. So not just what we measure in terms of deals, but perhaps what we can directly observe as far as the effect of blended finance in certain sectors and regions, at least in one instance. The report, of course, also examines different climate themes, including mitigation, adaptation, nature-based solutions, and cross-cutting climate blended finance transactions. And the last one is very important. Financing volume for cross-cutting deals increased from an average of $2 billion between 2014 and 2022 to over $6 billion in 2023. And finally, the report takes a close look at nationally determined contributions. So how has blended finance been leveraged to support the implementation of NDCs in Rwanda, Belize, and Indonesia, for example? Now, I've said enough. We're extremely excited to share the findings of this year's report in our climate edition. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to my colleague, Ilse Weinstein-Wright, to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Nnamdi. Hello, everyone. My name is Ilse Weinstein-Wright, and I'm an associate on the content team at Convergence. In this section, I will provide a high-level overview of the climate blended finance market, where I will first provide a snapshot of the market, and then discuss key trends in sources of capital and then climate themes. Next slide, please. As many of us know, macroeconomic pressures in 2023 have severely impacted the broader climate finance market. For many emerging markets and developing economies, one major outcome has been that they are increasingly being forced to make a choice between supporting climate mitigation and adaptation efforts on the one hand, and meeting debt service requirements on the other. However, as we can see here on this slide, the climate blended finance market has demonstrated remarkable resilience amid the fiscal pressures of 2023. We are pleased to announce that the climate blended finance market registered its highest ever financing total, reaching upwards of $18 billion in deal volume. In fact, all growth in the blended finance market last year can be attributed to increased investments in climate deals, with investments in non-climate deals remaining flat from 2022 to 2023. The substantial market growth over the past year was marked by a rising trend of climate deals delivering scaled solutions, or what we like to call at Convergence, whale transactions. In particular, 6 climate blended finance deals exceeding $1 billion emerged in 2023, which was roughly equivalent to the last 5 years combined. Many of these deals were in large greenfield infrastructure and energy projects, heavily financed using commercial bank loans. However, we are also observing progress in the emergence of portfolio-level assets that fulfill the investment criteria of institutional investors, such as the $1.1 billion SCG loan fund, which includes $1 billion from institutional investors. The emergence of these whale transactions are significant for 2 key reasons. First, they have undeniably contributed to substantial market growth in the blended finance market over the past year. And second, they represent a signpost of blended finance more consistently and more effectively opening the tap of institutional investor capital flows. Moving on to the next slide, we can see a breakdown of the different sources of financing in the climate blended finance market. The light blue segment of the bar chart indicates that last year was marked by a significant increase in private sector financing, with capital flows increasing 200% to a record total of $6.6 billion. The report outlines several factors that could explain this rise in private investment, including the growing attractiveness of long-term assets with retained value, such as green bonds, the increasing commercial viability of renewable energy sectors and emerging markets, and the presence of deals with larger ticket sizes that can attract institutional investors. Interestingly, as Namdi mentioned, this surge in private investment coincided with a decline in official development assistance, or ODA, which reached a 4-year low in 2023. The combination of these trends suggests that the market is evolving to use scarce catalytic capital in a potentially more strategic and effective manner compared to previous years, which will be elaborated on later in the presentation. Now, taking a closer look at the climate themes of these deals, we see that climate blended finance remains heavily focused on mitigation efforts, which is highlighted in the dark blue segment of the bar chart. Factors including investor familiarity and clearer revenue streams have driven this trend, allowing mitigation-focused deals to achieve comparatively larger median deal sizes and higher leverage ratios compared to cross-cutting and adaptation deals. However, it is worth noting that cross-cutting deals are gaining traction within the blended finance market. These deals combine mitigation and adaptation approaches, striving to lower emissions while simultaneously building resilience against climate impacts. While cross-cutting finance has typically averaged around $2 billion per year in aggregate financing, this number increased to $6.6 billion in 2023. Our report highlights that the growing appetite among commercial investors for cross-cutting investments could be linked to them containing elements that they may be more familiar with and seen as less risky to traditional investors compared to pure adaptation transactions. I will now pass things over to my colleague Ishri Savant, who will delve into some of the key investor trends.
Thanks, Ilsa. My name is Ishwari Savant, and I'm an associate at Convergence. I'll provide an overview of the key investor trends in the climate blended finance market. We'll first take a look at how commercial investors participate in climate transactions and how financing volumes have changed in recent years. Public sector spending continues to outpace private sector investment in climate blended finance. In fact, the gap between public and private sector spending has widened to an average of $2.95 billion per year. Despite this gap, private sector financing reached $6 billion in 2023. Corporates and project developers have been the most active commercial investors. However, as highlighted in this graph, financial institutions lead in terms of financing volume. Among private sector investors, they have been the most consistently engaged in climate-blended finance, often participating in more than one transaction. Over the past 3 years, this investor class has primarily invested in projects, followed by companies. The strong presence of financial institutions in the climate-blended finance market can be attributed to their sectoral focus within climate finance, specifically in renewable energy and energy efficiency. I would like to highlight that financing from institutional investors rebounded sharply in 2023, as seen in this graph. But this was primarily due to one transaction, which was the SDG loan fund. While this investor class continues to participate in blended transactions on an ad hoc basis, it is noteworthy that over the past 3 years, 60% of all blended finance deals involving institutional investors have focused on climate initiatives. We see this as an encouraging sign of appetite from key investor groups for scaled investment opportunities. Moving on to the next slide, let's examine the concessional commitments made by different investors. Here, we want to highlight how the investment activities of development agencies and multi-donor pools have led to a shift in the blending archetypes used within the climate-blended finance market. Development agencies and multi-donor pools most frequently provide technical assistance grants. However, last year, concessional senior debt became the primary instrument used by this investor class. This shift is due to the frequent deployment of concessional senior debt by DFIs and MDPs through donor-funded blended finance capital pools combined with lending from their own accounts. An important trend to note is the increase in the use of guarantees by development agencies, up by 125% over the past 2 years. This trend aligns with what we have observed in the broader climate-blended finance market, where the use of guarantees as blending archetypes has doubled over the past 3 years. Meanwhile, the proportion of technical assistance grants has declined. This shift is likely due to the updated OECD DAC policies, which now allow guarantees and risk insurance to count towards donor countries' official development assistance. Moving on to the next slide, we'll now take a look at investor trends for the different climate themes. The graph shows that investor commitments in blended finance have largely focused on climate mitigation. Debt is the primary financing instrument for mitigation-focused projects. This is largely due to the use of projects and corporate finance structures in mitigation efforts. A key highlight from this year's report is that blended finance has successfully mobilized higher levels of private sector financing for adaptation. Over 30% of blended adaptation financing for the past 3 years was sourced from private sector investors. This is noteworthy given that attracting private sector investment in climate adaptation has often been challenging, and especially when we consider that global adaptation funding from private sources was less than 2%. In terms of cross-cutting measures, public investors play a significant role, contributing 40% of total financing for these transactions. Notably, the proportion of financing from private sector investors in these initiatives has increased to 54% in recent years. These transactions contain elements that may be more familiar and are seen as less risky to traditional investors than pure adaptation transactions. The combination of adaptation and mitigation also offers private sector investors the opportunity to make potentially short-term tangible returns through mitigation elements while building climate resilience through adaptative measures. I'll now hand it over to Robin Ivory to speak about the NDCs.
Great. Thanks very much, Ishwari. My name is Robin Ivory, and I'm a senior associate at Convergence. I'll be speaking to the thematic portion of the report. This year, we've decided to focus the theme, as been mentioned, on how blended finance can be used to accomplish the goals of developing countries' nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. At a high level, NDCs are voluntary climate action plans, where countries commit to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and building resilience. They were introduced under the Paris Agreement in 2015. Each country determines its own targets based on its capabilities and national priorities, with the idea that these commitments should become more ambitious over time. Beyond emissions targets, many NDCs also include goals for the mobilization of climate finance. At COP26 in 2021, while countries reaffirmed their commitment to strengthen their NDCs, developed countries also pledged to increase their financial support for climate finance to developing countries. It's recommended that NDCs be updated every 5 years. So in 2025, the second cycle will see another round of updated NDC plans. As countries work towards their goals and setting updated targets, there's room for blended finance to play a role in closing some of the associated financing gaps. Within this report, we focus on 3 countries that are actively working towards their NDC goals, namely Rwanda, Belize, and Indonesia. Each of these countries will be highly impacted by climate change, and each have their own priorities and challenges. Moving on to the next slide, we can see that at the high level, it was possible to draw some key takeaways shared between them that has led to 3 recommendations for how blended finance can help countries achieve their NDC commitments. The first is that donors should deploy technical assistance, or TA, to support emerging market and developing economy country or governments in the creation of comprehensive time-bound investment roadmaps. There is currently a high level of fragmentation between key stakeholders within developing country NDCs, and this has led to a fairly uncoordinated response. Stronger partnerships and collaboration platforms can help create spaces for discussions around pipeline development and the support of bankable countries at a country level. TA partners can help resource-constrained governments build and publish credible investment roadmaps to align their upstream NDC priorities with downstream investable opportunities for the private sector. These roadmaps could detail the climate priorities where private investment will be most crucial to success, and also where the government can act as an incentivizing force. Already, there are instances of organizations doing this, such as NDC partnerships, who we'll hear from later in the panel discussion. However, more could be done to increase private financial flows to NDC-aligned transactions. This is especially important in countries that have low government fiscal capacity for climate-related investments, and that may also have little local capital mobilization ability and small private sectors, such as Rwanda and Belize. In these cases, it is essential to creating an enabling environment that appeals to private investors on a global scale to fill those financing gaps associated with their commitments. And related to this, the second recommendation is that TA support should not only help form investment roadmaps, but it must also assist in reviewing and reforming EMD domestic policy landscapes. This would help to address any policy disincentives to investing in projects in NDC-aligned sectors. Scalable private investment will only flow when policy incentives supporting fossil fuel technologies are addressed and reformed. And this is especially important in countries that currently heavily rely on fossil fuels, such as Indonesia. The country's ability to decarbonize its power sector will be fundamental to the achievement of the country's NDC goals. In particular, renewable energy still has a high perceived risk in Indonesia, despite high appetite from investors. And to this end, not only can TA be used to help create policies that encourage the use of renewable energy, but of course also to de-risk transactions in the sector. Third and finally, donors in international financial institutions that are more experienced in climate finance can support the mobilization of local private sector institutions into domestic NDC projects by partnering with them within the transactions. The knowledge exchange and reassurance provided by more experienced international investors investing alongside local capital can serve to demystify climate-blended finance and thereby catalyze local investors in greater numbers. Local investors' knowledge of the local investment landscape, meanwhile, can also provide confidence to international investors and reduce their risk perceptions. Overall, the report contains more country-level analysis within each of its 3 case studies. So I encourage you to visit convergence.finance to download the report. For now, Ilsa, Ishwari, and myself are happy to field any questions that come in through the chat box before we turn it over to Joan Luria for the panel discussion. So I'll give it a few moments for those who do have questions who want to enter it into the chat box, and then we'll begin the Q&A portion of the presentation. So we can start off because I've seen a few questions have come in regarding some of these big whale transactions, which we've heard of a few times throughout this presentation. And there's a few questions that are revolving around why we're seeing these big whale transactions in such a burst this year compared to other years. And also, do we see this trend persisting? So, Ilse, maybe I can pass it over to you and you can take that one.
Thank you, Robin. So yes, we're really excited here at Convergence to see this emergence of these whale transactions. And like I spoke about earlier, the number that we have seen this year differs than previous years, and it is a burst of action, like you kind of said, Robin. And this is likely due to a combination of factors. One is the fact that catalytic capital, like we said earlier, is becoming smarter or more effective at crowding in private investment. For instance, we find that guarantees are being used more frequently, and they offer a more capital efficient means of de-risking investments, which has become increasingly important given the finite pool of concessional capital. The second reason could be that we are seeing that private capital is more willing to get involved in these transactions. For instance, I spoke about the SCG loan fund earlier, which achieved actually a mobilization ratio of 1 to 9, where $1 of catalytic capital, which was provided by FMO, might mobilize $9 of private sector capital. So these combination of factors have really led to this emergence that we've seen this past year. And it's unclear at this point whether we will see this trend persist and these large-scale transactions continue into the future years. But of course, at Convergence, this is something that we're always looking towards to scale the market and scale climate solutions that are really needed in developing countries and emerging economies. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elsa. I see we also have a few questions regarding the use of guarantees, which earlier in the presentation, we spoke a little bit about how there's been an increase in guarantees. So specifically, we've seen that, of course, this blended finance increased use of guarantees. So maybe Ishwari, you can speak a little bit to the projects or sectors where guarantees have been especially effective in de-risking investments.
Thanks, Robin. So as Ilse mentioned, guarantees are often viewed as an effective instrument for mobilizing private sector finance, and this year's report highlights this perspective. In terms of the vehicles used, we see that guarantees were used most for company financing and project financing. These transactions primarily targeted the infrastructure sector and the energy sector. So guarantees were provided primarily for climate mitigation and cross-cutting transactions. We haven't seen any yet for climate adaptation. The main reason we see guarantees in these sectors and these climate themes is because they draw significant private sector appetite given their traditional structured revenue and return flows. So we've seen that over, I would say, 70% of these transactions were in lower middle income countries. And then about, I would say, 30% were in low income countries. And this is primarily because of an established understanding of guarantees among deal sponsors in the region, as well as in-country guarantee personnel. And I think another factor that is contributing to this is this common perception that among commercial investors for this need to offset the risk of political and governance risks in the region. So that's why we see an increased use of guarantees in these regions. I'll hand it back to you, Robin.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We had a question come in from Leslie Porris. And the question is, could you highlight what your findings have shown in relation to adaptation finance? So I am happy to take that. We've seen kind of a dip in 2022 in adaptation, followed by a slight recovery in 2023. And in 2021, some of the highest amounts of climate financing we've seen had gone to adaptation finance. However, it's still important to note that in comparison to mitigation, climate adaptation continues to be extremely underfunded, and there's still a lot of room for private investors to get involved in this space. There are obviously some difficulties associated with adaptation that private investors are hesitant to invest in. So we see a lot of these challenges, such as lack of standardized metrics, the existence of public goods. So a lot of these adaptation transactions contain elements of positive externalities of public goods that investors may not be willing to pay for. There's also oftentimes less obvious revenue streams. So there are a few challenges that we're seeing facing adaptation transactions. But the positive news is that we are seeing increased creative ways which investors are entering this space. So we're seeing a huge uptick in interest around things like nature-based solutions, which can be oftentimes cross-cutting deals. So those that contain elements of mitigation and adaptation components, as well as things like carbon credits, which are, again, kind of in that cross-cutting area. So a lot of the ways that we're seeing private investors overcome these hesitancies is by starting to invest in cross-cutting deals that not only help adaptation, and again, as was mentioned in the presentation, they help adaptation, but they also have more familiar aspects of investment opportunities for private investors through the mitigation side. So hopefully that answers that question. I'm going to see what other questions are coming in here. There's a question from Alyssa regarding how much climate finance is offered in terms of equity junior tranche investment by the public sector to crowd in private capital. Ilse and Ishwari, do either of you want to take it? Otherwise, I'm happy to speak to this. Okay, I can go ahead and speak to, we don't have the exact, apologies, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me in terms of how much is often offered for equity junior tranche investment to the public sector, but we do see public sector oftentimes choose to invest in concessional debt and equity as a primary form of blended finance as a tool. So we see this as an effective means of blended finance because as a junior tranche investor, it really de-risks the transaction in a way that allows the private sector to come in and feel comfortable investing. So it takes that kind of first loss position, which removes some of the risk. So there's more information in the report about kind of how much the public sector is investing in these different tools and how much this is mobilizing in terms of our leverage ratios. So I encourage you to check that out. I'm looking again at the chat. Someone is asking about regional distribution. So if there's any data on the regional distribution of these transactions, and also at what point do you collect this data? Are these actual flows or quote unquote commitments? So maybe I can pass this over to Ilse.
Thank you. Yeah, so we do cover the regional and country breakdown of these deals in the report. Consistently throughout, we reference trends if they're notable in certain regions, but we have a specific section on page 25. The climate blended finance market continues to be predominantly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa when looking at deal activity, so that's deal count. However, we've seen some interesting trends, including an increase in climate blended finance deals in the Middle East and North Africa. Also, when you look at South Asia and the East Asia and the Pacific combined, we see that climate blended finance is also very strong there. We discuss in the report various challenges that each region face and areas that blended finance has been effective at mobilizing investment. So discussing issues such as coal plant decommissioning in the East Asia and Pacific, which is very important, and other dimensions related to that. And then in terms of the technicality, these are commitments. So when a deal reaches financial close, the commitments are, these financing totals are based on the commitments by different investors in the deal.
Thanks, Ilse. So we have time for one more question. And there has been a question that comes in on NDCs and specifically which blended finance mechanisms have proven most effective in attracting private capital, especially in countries where implementing NDCs remains challenging, and are there any emerging models that address these specific needs? So we will see that we are seeing increased amounts of blended finance being used to address climate situations and NDC-aligned transactions. We spoke a little bit in the presentation and in the report. One of the recommendations is the use of TA to create an enabling environment to deal with some of the policy regulations that may be hindering private investment within a country's economy. Of course, there are other methods of blended finance that can be used to mobilize private investment into these countries to help close that financing gap. We've seen a lot around the use of concessional financing from multilateral funds, which gives governments fiscal capacity in order to be able to spend money on areas that might be committed or uncommitted within their NDC plans. So we're seeing, again, some interesting models that are coming out. In the case studies, we go into more in-depth transactions that are NDC aligned for each country. So again, encourage you to look at that because we do highlight certain blended finance transactions that have not just TA, but the use of guarantees, the use of concessional capital, et cetera. So I'm looking at the time now, and it is 9:30. So it is time for the panel discussion. I'm going to pass it now over to our CEO, Joan Larea, who's going to introduce the panelists and kick that off. So thank you, everyone, for your questions and your involvement, and looking forward to the next part of this presentation. Over to you, Joan.
Thank you. And I do want to thank the team. This has been an all-of-firm effort to put the report out. And you've seen only 3 people of the many who worked on it. So thank you all. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. We're thrilled to see so many of you from so many places dialing in. We're going to run about a half-hour panel followed by about 15 minutes of questions. And the discussion is intended to draw out some views on blended finance from 3 terrific guests representing respectively one from a multi-stakeholder initiative on the NDCs, which are a focus of this year's report. Someone who represents a coalition of major financial institutions, so the private sector, and a representative of a regional development bank. I'll explain more as we go, but let's welcome Guli Sabahi, Randy Christensen, and Dr. Olufunso Somoren to please turn on your cameras. Join the conversation. Great, thank you, all 3 of you. I'm going to start first with Guli Sabahi. Guli is a senior advisor for climate finance at the NDC Partnerships Support Unit. Now, the NDCs, for those of you who don't live in this space, are, as Robin described earlier, each country's nationally determined contributions or a statement of that country's commitment to under the Paris Accord. And the NDC Partnership was stood up to bring together over 200 members, including UN agencies, countries, multilateral banks, and others for collective action on the Paris Agreement. So Guli, we're going to start with you, and then we'll go to Randy and Dr. Somoren as well. So first of all, the NDC Partnership has put out a document called the Climate Investment Planning and Mobilization Framework, which I believe was jointly produced with the Green Climate Fund. You can correct me on that if I have that wrong. What was the NDC Partnership's motivation behind the creating of this framework? What problem are you trying to solve?
Thank you. You got it right, Joanne. The Climate Investment Planning and Mobilization Framework has been developed jointly by NDC Partnership and GCF as a non-prescriptive guide, bringing together the collective experience of climate investment planning and mobilization processes at country level. In terms of rationale, 2 key points. Number one of the main purposes is fostering a programmatic approach championed by NDC Partnership and GCF and anchored on a strong climate development rationale. The framework offers guidance on defining and implementing countries' climate development priorities on a programmatic basis, and identifying early on the investment opportunities and projects that would most qualify for blended finance for that additionality point. So by using the framework, the countries that are seeking support for their NDC-aligned projects can have a full and integrated picture of both their upstream and downstream processes. The framework indicates the importance of the planning and upstream work and early investor engagement in NDC processes, to hopefully minimize the roadblocks in mobilizing finance downstream. And another key point I wanted to mention in terms of the purposes of the framework is really to provide common reference point and language for countries as well as providers of finance from private sector and partners and capacity support providers to navigate the progressive steps involved in moving from planning stages, from the upstream stages to implementation at country level. And as we all know, there is a great need for more coordinated action across government levels, including, importantly, the ministries of finance. We need coordination with the providers of finance from different sources and the capacity support that is provided by partners and philanthropic institutions. And the framework can be used to foster collective effort with stakeholders playing complementary roles in supporting country-led NDC processes and providing more targeted assistance, including for blended finance in mobilizing finance at scale and speed required. So those are the two main purposes of the framework.
Thanks. And listening to you talk about the upstream work required, you can see why we're recommending in our report that donors really focus on TA for governments for that upstream work on NDCs. And the blended finance world is all about collective action and collaboration across lines. So I understand that point very well as well. So tell me, I have to ask a blended finance question since we're a blended finance house. How does blended finance, or how can it best support emerging markets and developing economy countries or governments in creating NDCs that are more investable by the private sector? Because the private sector naturally think of NDCs when they think about going to a place to invest. Are there any examples of where this has worked in practice?
Well, first of all, having confidence in NDCs and effective blended finance can provide necessary finance for priority investment opportunities by optimizing that use of public sector capital and philanthropic capital and mobilizing private capital at greater scale. You will see in our NDC 3.0 Navigator tool, we reflect on those points under Unlocking Finance section, providing essentially different guidance and reference points for countries and stakeholders to use in basically interlinking those points. Many NDC projects, particular adaptation projects, dual benefit projects, but also some mitigation projects in certain countries would require a blended finance, and identifying projects that would qualify for blended finance requires also determining on a more programmatic basis, preferably, which of those projects and programs have potential of commercial viability. And so the prioritization of projects for blended finance, what type of risks need to be mitigated, what type of blended finance instruments would be most appropriate, who is in the best position to bear which risk, all of those questions, they require careful thought and the input from both private sector and the partners, and of course, countries. And this is the work at the country level, supported and by partners. So early engagement of investors in NDC processes in providing such input and in identifying and developing those NDC-aligned opportunities would help make NDCs more investable. In terms of the example, we are engaged with blended finance platforms, including those, for example, that are managed by climate fund managers, and some of their funds focus on mitigation opportunities, some on adaptation opportunities. But one of the important things that we have been looking at and trying to interlink is the NDC priorities of countries should be taken into consideration when blended finance investors or other investors, businesses make their investment decisions. So we have, as I mentioned, some good examples of where that interlinking of blended finance investors' investment decisions are beginning to kind of interlink with countries' climate development priorities. But we need to make sure that alignment is further mainstreamed and standardized as much as possible.
Yeah, there's a few interesting points I'm taking away. One is the availability of blended finance and investors signaling what they want gives countries the confidence to develop more ambitious NDCs. I hadn't thought of that, but thank you very much for that. I have one quick last question. I want to turn to our other two panelists. So NDC Partnership has done a number of listening rounds, a global stock take to get feedback from private investors, among other parties, on the NDC's program. So how do you get the private sector is a huge word, right? How do you get the private sector better engaged in the development of NDCs? In, for example, picking out policy levers that would be important to get them to invest in things that are aligned with a country's NDC?
No, that's a very important question. Private sector engagement is a priority under our finance strategy. We have conducted a series of consultations with private sector, including with over 100 private sector stakeholders on this framework, including your team at Convergence, and thank you very much for all the helpful input there. So, looking at NDCs, the expectation is that they will be serving as economic blueprints for that transformational climate development action. So NDCs are expected to outline sectoral pathways and priorities in achieving NDC targets, but they're also expected to signal some clear policy levers, in the form of both carrots and sticks for market creation. So what we're trying to do, with NDCs as a global community is to drive real economy investments and unlock financing at different levels and create those market-driven transactions. So for that, the input from the private sector would be very helpful to really understand what are those foundational considerations that need to be in NDCs that would help them link with and then inform the resulting national transition plans and investment plans, depending on how the country is doing this. So this private sector engagement in NDC processes is important. It's relatively new, and support from partners and philanthropists would be critical in getting that engagement and those entry points during the NDC development processes to make sure that the work at the country level on NDCs is informed and takes into account the issues on enabling environment and what are the strategies for private capital mobilization and how countries could really more efficiently use blended finance to finance their NDCs.
Thank you. I have been a part of some of those listening rounds, and the carrots and sticks comment I even recognize is coming from a private sector party that said, you really need to signal to us what we are supposed to be investing in and discouraged from, and what rewards and penalties come with doing things that align with the NDC. So I recognize that comment. I want to turn to Randy next. Now, Randy's the JETP policy lead at GFANZ. So let me separate first out the layers of alphabet soup involved in this conversation. First of all, GFANZ is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is a coalition of major financial institutions committed to accelerating to net zero transition. And a JETP, which is the other part of Randy's title, is a Just Energy Transition Partnership, basically a country's game plan for transitioning away from fossil fuels. And if I said any of that wrong, Randy, you can correct me as well. So welcome. I do have a couple questions for you before we go to Dr. Somorin. So Guli talked about policy levers a minute ago and how private sector parties can be involved in setting out what gets them to invest or not invest in certain things. Now, GFANZ has come out with a guide on early coal retirement in the Asia-Pacific region, which I found really interesting. And in that region, or for all of us, actually, Indonesia is really important. So from your alliance's point of view, from GFANZ's point of view, representing financial institutions, what are the greatest policy barriers impeding private investment within Indonesia toward climate-aligned sectors? And to what extent can policy changes enable greater flows from the private sector? Can you touch on that for us, please?
Yes, thank you so much, Joan. And I do apologize for the alphabet soup. We do love our acronyms in the climate space, don't we? But I think if we kind of start, Indonesia is very important, and I will turn to Indonesia. But if we start at kind of a macro level, I think consistency on policy is just key, no matter which country we talk about. So from your NDCs down to your sector policies, down to your implementing kind of regulations, there needs to be clear consistency across the policies, because otherwise it creates less of a comfort for private sector. Private sector needs that kind of stability, policy stability and policy consistency. And if you don't have consistency across your policies, then private sector will start to question what is it the government actually wants. I also think that just understanding that cross-ministerial plans needs to be consistent. If we talk about energy sector, for example, if we're an energy ministry is expecting huge energy demand growth or electricity demand growth because electrification in the transport sector is happening, well, then the transport ministry also needs to have clear kind of policies that actually incentivize that. Otherwise, you again start to say like, oh, hold up, wait a minute, this investment that this ministry sees over here might not actually be consistent with the policies set over there. And that becomes a problem for the private sector. And when we talk about private sector, and again, I represent the private sector that is the financial institutions, but we do tend to look a lot on implementing regulations, so less on the higher level regulation, just because the implementing regulation is actually what sets the revenues and so on, and does dictate the investment that happen. So on a wider scale, I think for Indonesia and other EDMEs, some of the policies that tend to hinder private sector is things that tend to skew incentives. So for example, fossil fuel subsidies, or lacking targets, or in the energy efficiency space, in the industry space, if you don't have standards for energy efficiency, or if you have very lax tools, so to speak, to follow up. So we're again talking about sticks and carrots here, which become really, really important. And for Indonesia, for example, it is very clear that policies such as local content requirement, while it's really important to build up local supply chains, maybe local content requirements actually hinder that kickstart of a sector that shows you a long, big pipeline that investors need to be able to invest in manufacturing. That's an example. Or the coal subsidy that does skew your incentive in terms of what fossil or what fuel you use as generation input. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not the first to observe this, but a private sector investor can adapt to any environment if it's stable. Yes. Even if it's not perfect, if it's stable, it helps. And you're also talking about pointing out the inconsistencies in the game, the rules of the game that really hinder things as well. Can you tell me a bit about again, blended finance? I have to ask a blended finance question. So what role does blended finance play in helping, say, Indonesia's NDC priorities, or any country in that region, and in particular, getting financial investors interested in the NDC priorities? What are the risks that you're trying to cover? What sectors do you see as having the greatest need for support in the form of blending? Would you like to touch on that?
Yes, please. So I'm all about blended finance. The JETPs are fundamentally about the catalytic use of public capital to crowd in private finance, and that is blending at its core. So it is a very good question. I think, first of all, when you look at Indonesia versus other EDMEs, it's really important to recognize that Indonesia is actually an investment grade country, which means that blended finance tends to be used in different ways than it does if it's not an investment grade country. So big kind of macro risks and so on tend to not need to be covered that much when you're talking about investment grade, but other things do need to be covered. Now, I think it is really important to talk about two speeds when you talk about blended finance, because blended finance in an investment grade environment in general, at least in my view, and in terms of using catalytic capital effectively, does need to be used in the more kind of pioneering areas. So plain vanilla renewables that everybody knows is probably not the best use of blended finance, whereas things that are still facing technology risk, or the first time that's used in a country, is potentially more relevant. Now, we do know that some EDMEs have policy issues that kind of slow down renewables deployment. So I think Indonesia has made great strides in their power purchase agreements, for example, but it is not uncommon to see power purchase agreements for renewable generation be a little bit unattractive to private sector. Now, guarantees, for example, which was mentioned very adequately in the report presentation, is a really great tool to come in and mitigate some of those risks, but it cannot become a sense of complacency, because what is not supposed to happen is that the government says, oh, we can mobilize all of this finance for these renewable energy investments. Just see that they're happening. Yes, but it should be a bridging tool because, as we all know, public finance is finite and it is scarce. So using it places where policy could actually come in and change and make the blending less needed is really, really important. But we also don't want to stop investments. We know we're really on a deadline with getting these investments out and getting capital mobilized. So using it for a limited amount of time to make sure that we bridge as long as policies are still being changed is okay. But for the more plain standard investments in solar PV and wind and so on, I don't see it having a huge need, especially in an investment grade EDME.
Right, and blended finance should be rare, right? It should be what you do once you've tinkered with policy and other things, if you possibly can do so. And your point about the more surgical application of concessional resources in an investment grade country, I take that on board fully. In another country that is not investment grade or not as familiar, I think your first of a kind issues pop up more often. You have first of a kind exposure to the country, first of a kind, even renewables in a country. And I think those countries need of blending principles. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to ask you one last question, if you could touch on it really quickly, because I don't want to lose time for Dr. Somarin's comments as well. Just tell me a bit about, a lot of activities all about getting foreign investors, say, into Indonesia. What can be done from your point of view, again, representing financial investors, what can be done to better engage local investors in an energy transition in a place like Indonesia or anywhere else with a jet P?
So I think the jet Ps, because you have the just element, that question is incredibly important. So I think it's about understanding what are the strengths of international investors versus local investors. Local investors tend to have a huge strength in smaller ticket sizes, especially if your capital markets are not that deep. So making sure that there's capacity building in local investors' ability to assess these products and potentially international investors coming in and creating a little bit of support or creating some on-lending opportunities if they don't have kind of the balance sheet to handle it. But making sure that you understand and utilize that local investor infrastructure, I think, is really, really important. Now, when you're talking about some of the kind of deep decarbonization and the larger infrastructure projects, you might just need some of the internationals that's done it before to come in and model it first. But again, this whole idea of technology transfer, I think, also applies to investors. So if you can create strategic partnerships between international investors and local investors, you also get some of this knowledge transfer that I think is so incredibly important, because the jet Ps is all about creating a sustainable investment environment in a country where you have healthy contributions from domestic and international investors. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, and that tech transfer would go both ways. There are a lot of things that a local institution would know that we foreigners would have no idea about. So I think it's a mutual flow. Dr. Olufunso Somarin, thank you for your patience. So he is the Regional Principal Officer at African Development Bank, and it's great to have a development bank perspective and an African one in this conversation, given this, first of all, the significant increase in development bank commercial activity around blended finance that we recorded in our report, and also because of the continuing large incidence of transactions that are blended happening on the continent of Africa. So great to have you. And I'm going to dive in. I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, let's start with Rwanda, which is one of the countries that we focused on our report, and which is a really interesting place from blended finance and international finance point of view these days. So our report highlights that about 90% of the financing for Rwanda's NDC-related projects or investments comes from grants and public budgets. So from your perspective, what are the key barriers the private sector faces in joining in these climate projects? And how do you see blended finance playing a role in motivating more private sector investment for climate-related projects in Rwanda? How do we go from 90% to something different? What does that look like?
Right, great. Can you hear me loud and clear? Thank you, Joanne. The advantage of being the last speaker is you can just agree with the very brilliant points that the previous speakers provided. And thanks again for the work that you do at Convergence. Very incredibly important on the continent. Before I answer the question, I think it's important to put two ideas on the table. And the first is that we must not make the mistake to think that when it comes to the quantum of billions and trillions needed globally, particularly in developing countries, to respond to climate change, we must not assume that that quantum of resources are not available, or that quantum is not available. I think our biggest challenge is not that money is not available. Our biggest challenge is that money is not evenly distributed. And the problem we're solving is a distribution problem. It's not capital adequacy problem. That's the first point I want to make. The second point is, for the longest also, we've made the mistake to think of private sector in any country as an homogeneous entity. We tend to just cluster everything, private sector. But the truth is, when you unpack it, you understand that it's a very heterogeneous entity, and they operate at different levels, and you need different entry points in being able to crowd them in or to engage them effectively. And so the question about barriers to private capital, particularly for adaptation, it's a very relevant one. Thanks for asking that. And it's also not a very new question. And I think all of us here, if you've ever been in the climate change space, you have had to answer that question at one point. Let me say, in the interest of time, from my own experience, there are three fundamental challenges that are responsible to this low investment. And I think your report really alluded to the numbers. The first barrier is what I call knowledge gap or information asymmetry. When it comes to the body of knowledge, critical climate-related knowledge that is needed to make an informed decision-making, particularly in the financial sector, I think there's a disparity between the quantum of resources, knowledge resources available for the private sector, but unfortunately different from the one for the public sector. And we need to think critically through how do we bring this information closer, good information, good knowledge about impact, and how do we help the private sector, both in an umbrella term, but specifically to the different players within this group, to be able to embrace this information and help them to make the right decision-making, particularly when it comes to risk management. And you can't talk about private investment without talking about risk, whether the perception of risk or the actuality of risk. So it's very important to be able to break that knowledge gap and the asymmetries in information. The second thing is adaptation, unfortunately, is an unfortunate child of climate action. Even though it's an important aspect in the African context, most of the benefits in adaptation are largely non-monetary and qualitative in nature.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, our private sector colleagues tend to look at things that are more quantitative, that are easily available in numbers, and that can be put to financial terms. And so it's a challenge. And in itself, it's a paradox, because when you think about it, most of the economies on the continent are largely built within areas where adaptations is most needed, whether it's agriculture, water, natural resource management, local livelihood systems, social sector, health. These are the sectors that really hold the economies of this country, and yet they're the sectors that are most vulnerable. And you want to think through how can we get the benefits of adaptation in a quantifiable and put them in monetary terms. In a way, it's a market failure, because the system, the private sector approach, is not able to quantify environmental and social benefits for the challenge. Last point, we suffer from what we call the tragedy of horizon when it comes to private sector investment. Most private sector investment, because of their capital structure, are largely for medium to short-term investment. Adaptation tends to be more on the long term. And this across many countries on the continent, perhaps beyond as well. These are some of the barriers, but they are not impossible to solve. And I think blended finance comes in to really help in solving that problem, whether it's making information available, helping us to do cost-benefit analysis of projects upfront at programmatic, at pipeline level, or even to help us be able to use the available public resources in a way that helps us to de-risk investment at different stages, at the different value chain of those investments, and ultimately bring in private capital, or even to help us bring in new players that are not in the traditional spaces. Insurance companies can be part of your investment stakeholder group, capital market, institutional investors, and we've seen that in your report as well. So I'll keep it there for now. It's a bit of the challenge, traditional challenges that we know, but we're also beginning to see that we can do blended finance differently in addressing those challenges.
Yeah, you touched on so many important challenges there where blended finance might be able to play the qualitative I shouldn't say nature of nature, but the qualitative aspects of measuring the outcome of a project other than on the financial side, the long horizon of things like mangrove restoration, the who benefits. You know, the investor doesn't necessarily monetize the benefit of a lot of these transactions unless it's structured for them to benefit in some way. And we need additional players in the mix. So all of these are really problems that are very, very acute on the adaptation side, as you pointed out. I want to go to Rwanda specifically because it has done some interesting things that might start to address some of these things. For example, it introduced last year a green taxonomy, actually at COP28. And that's, as I understand it, the second of its kind in Africa. How does a green taxonomy spur private sector interest in investing? And what could other neighboring countries or other countries in the region take away from that idea or that experience? Is there something there where a taxonomy unleashes action? What do you think?
No, good question. Thank you. I think in a simple way, a green taxonomy is more of a framework document that helps us to address the information asymmetries and perhaps the knowledge gap on the one hand, but also in a way it helps us to build standardized metrics of measurement. And it helps us to be able to compare actions across different sectors. And I think it's very important to acknowledge the leadership in Rwanda. I'm a big fan of the NDC engagement in Rwanda, the approaches, some of the innovative ideas. And what the green taxonomy does is, in a way, we set a bit of a list of criteria, sustainability criteria, if we may, to the private sector in order to be able to help them understand what are the entry points and how can they account their work, their engagement or the operations in any way to contribute to the green investment or the green the implementation of NDC in the country. But secondly, as well, it's also important that a good green taxonomy should help you address issues or risk of greenwashing. And I think Rwanda is very, very particular about that. So that there's a comparability of actions, even across different sectors, but more importantly, there's an open and transparent approach to how you engage, what you measure, and how you measure it, but ultimately what that contributes to on the ground. And there's a lot to learn. So a lot of countries are beginning to work on their green taxonomy, and it becomes, let's consider it to be a template for organizing actions, but also being able to manage and crowding investment flows.
That's, yeah, two really good points. Clarity, which is what the other commenters, particularly Randy, were talking about, clarity of what we're talking about, what is green, and also helping investors avoid a perception of greenwashing, which is a big deal for a private sector investor managing its reputation across its operations. I want to open this up. Thank you, all three of you. I want to open this up for questions. We already have some building up, and if anybody would like to type questions, I believe my colleagues will help field them. But one question I had, actually probably would go back to Randy, if I might. Have you seen trends of climate financing flowing? This is from Julia De La Cruz. Have you seen trends of climate financing flowing toward sub-state actors and climate finance projects, such as electric utilities and clean energy projects? Often at the sub-state level, they have difficulty accessing climate finance, given that a lot of the intermediaries are Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Environment level. Do you see any action there? And maybe Guli, if you want to chime in as well. Any of you.
So,
Let me start with Randy.
so we're definitely seeing that, and it tends to depend on the structure in the country. If we go back to Indonesia, for example, and the power sector, which is one of the biggest sources of emissions because of their use of coal and that lock-in, you have one big state utility. And they're definitely getting climate finance and also blended finance on their own. It doesn't always have to go through Ministry of Finance. I will though say, to get the kind of the highest level of concessionality, you do need a counter sovereign guarantee, and thus you need the Ministry of Finance involved, for example, and that needs to be balanced with the debt levels in the country and so on. I have also seen that in some cases, for example, energy efficiency initiatives could be done really efficiently at the subnational scale, but there will be sometimes some regulations that prohibits subnationals from certain lending structures. So those can also be an inhibitor. And then also you need, if you're talking about big blended finance structures, you typically need some scale to it. So making sure that you bundle some of those subnational actors where it's relevant can also help access that type of instrument. Thanks.
Yeah, Senator Guli, if you want to add briefly.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that subnational engagement is also part of the work that we do in the finance side, but I think when I spoke about using the framework for coordination at government levels, I think the work that, the things that Randy has said, that type of planning in terms of, where, subnational actors could have access to finance and be providers of finance, but where they also come in more on the implementing side needs to be clarified. And it's very different from country to country, but that's very important considerations, and that coordination needs to happen, the vertical integration. There are great initiatives like CHAMP and others that are working on that. So a very important point.
And Dr. Sommeren, do you see a lot of action on the subnational level in your region?
Oh, yes, very much so. I live in Kenya, and here in this country, beyond the design of policy and even financial structures at national level, counties, which is subnational entities, have actually created an even climate change fund, and they are able to even have action plans at subnational level. And at their level, they're also able to define investment priorities. And there's that strong, and still, while the operation happens at the subnational level, there is still a strong alignment to the NDC at the central level. And so when you're counting the overall implementation, it then becomes an aggregate of both what is happening at national level, but also subnational entities that are very much nested within the key priorities of the NDCs.
So the person asking the question has a really good point, that it is a disconnect often between the ministries at the national level and then what municipalities and other sub-state actors have to do. But each of you has come up with good examples of where this is working in Kenya, and the Indonesian example was excellent as well. Thank you. I want to turn to another question that's come in, back to adaptation, and you're all welcome to answer it. It's from Kate Fellenberg. Are nature assets that can be traded, like carbon credits, biodiversity credits, etc., proving to be a solid incentive for private investors in NDCs? How has quantification of nature assets helped to boost investor confidence? And I realize that quantification is at its early stage, but are any of you seeing positive movement in that direction? Go ahead, Randy, please.
Thank you so much. I think it's both kind of a push and a pull to some extent, because some of the greenwashing issues that have been around these types of credits do hinder private sector appetite for them. But I also think that it is starting to be more and more accepted, especially in the coal transition conversation, that credits can be a really effective tool to crowd in more of the private finance and that side. And I think there's a lot of work being done currently on the integrity and the supply side of these types of things. But I do think there needs to be a little bit more work done on the demand side of these things to make them up and running. So at least from a GFAN's perspective, we're really excited about these things, but we do think it's quite nascent. And this work needs a really big effort. And we actually do hope to see that effort coming to fruition in the coming years, because we do think it's a really, really important tool to creating some of this monetization of, you know, how do you figure out how a live tree is more valuable than a dead tree, so to speak.
Yeah.
How many zebras per mangrove? Yes, I can imagine the issue. But your demand side is investor uptake of these instruments, right? And the supply side is the creation of credits. Is that how you think about it? Okay. Please go ahead.
Yeah, and I was just going. Oh, go ahead, please.
Please go ahead, Guli. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that it's as part of kind of our work on enabling environment. I think legal frameworks on carbon markets is a very important work where we see interest from both countries, but also, of course, you know, in mobilizing private capital for those transactions. And I think the integrity is important here, but also some of the property rights and transferability of those credits will be important considerations, I think, as part of the legal work at country level.
Yeah, great. No, I think it's already happening. It's just not happening at the scale that we would like to see to make a meaningful impact when it comes to NDC implementation. I think countries that are very big on the supply side have recognized that there's a way the market needs to be structured, where integrity must be the currency, not necessarily the CO2 emission, but it's the integrity. But it's also very important that there is also adequate pricing for it. I think from our position at the AFDB, we can't be talking about demand of integrity on the supply side and the whole range of methodology, engagement, knowledge, systems, everything that needs to come together to produce a high integrity, high quality 1 ton. And that 1 ton is priced at $6. So yeah, it's also very important because if the price is right and if it sets a very good incentive for measure for it, I think we can definitely see a massive opportunity in that space, not just for the NDC, but also ultimately driving adaptation actions on the ground.
Yeah, I don't want to be prescriptive about it, but I do see that pricing issue, and it's in the back of my mind as to whether you know, some concessional capital coming in to adjust that difference between the market value and the needed value to make it worth doing, whether there's a solution in there somewhere. So I'm waiting to see if someone comes up with the right answer there. We have some more questions building. One for Randy from Michael Hurley. How do you view the new country platforms being created by the likes of Brazil and Colombia, looking to learn from first-generation JETPs to attract more private finance? In what ways can they borrow and improve on the first wave of JETPs that came out?
That's a really good question. I think there's no doubt that country platforms are a lot of work. They're hard work. But I think one of the things that we're at least seeing in terms of these new country platforms coming up is understanding how important the project portfolio as such is, because having that solid pipeline to work with is important to be able to kind of roll out finance. We don't want to be in these traps where kind of people are sitting there saying, like, you know, where's the finance? And other people are saying, well, where's the projects? And then you're kind of a little bit stuck. I think, for example, if you see Brazil, they've done a really good job in having a cross-ministerial vision for their ecological transformation across the economy. And that's a really good basis for starting to get that country platform up and running, because one thing is if kind of external partners, and I'm not saying that this has happened in the other JETPs, I'm just saying, like, this is an example of what doesn't work, is if external partners create a transformation or a decarbonization platform and just hands the country and says, like, here, we will finance that. That's not how it's supposed to work, and it's not how it is working in the country platform. But that really, really core country ownership flagship across ministries, and that has buy-in at the very highest level of government is key, as I see it, to making country platforms work. But I will also say that even though the hard work, it is my day-to-day job, and I hope at some point to be out of a job because this just flows. But currently, I think it's the best kind of idea we have to creating these scales and creating these really credible investment plans to scale capital against. Thanks.
We have a question for Dr. Sommer in a minute, but I first want to give Guli a chance to add if you would like to, because this is all about country-led strategy. And what Randy has hit on is making sure that conversation originates inside a country and is not just handed to them. Would you like to add?
Absolutely, yeah. I just wanted to add that, NDC partnership, I think, represents something that is akin to country platform. And I think what makes NDC partnership very unique and also important for sectoral or thematic country platforms that are coming up is the work that we already have done in countries and continue doing. So I think a lot of the data on NDC priorities and investment needs of countries could be channeled and used by the country platforms more effectively, so they don't need to redo the work that has been already done and can take that into account. And also, as the country platforms are working and running into implementation challenges, right? There's certain things that would have been nice to get done on the upstream side, and that's where we could also provide more targeted support, whether that's a capacity building or enabling environment type of support that is missing to help that particular country platform, to implement its investment plan,
including a JET-P if it wishes to do so. That's part of its game plan. Interesting, thank you. The question that came in for Dr. Sommer was, do you find that development finance and blended finance into Africa is concentrated too strongly into a few countries? And if so, what could be done to equalize the receipt of important financing across the continent of Africa? I will point out that we've been talking about Rwanda, which, although it's a LDC, is investment grade. That is a question. Where should blended finance and development finance be going? Is it too concentrated? If so, what do we do?
No, I agree. It is too concentrated in a few countries. In fact, the entire climate finance flows to Africa, 60% of it is going to 10 countries. And barely the most vulnerable, poorest of the country that needs the resources most, they don't get up to 20% of the entire climate finance flow. So there's a huge disparity and inequality in the flow. Despite the fact that the resources are not enough when you match that against the needs. But even from whatever is coming to Africa is concentrated in few countries. What I think is important to do is, again, we must be able to start by unpacking where countries are at, and be able to have a targeted support to countries at the levels they are. We can't assume they are all on the same level. Even within the world of LDCs, there are still countries that are relatively easier to deal with. And there's always a question of policy stability, but also policy coherence as well. And you need to be able to have things in place. There are policy shifts that must happen before capital can flow in that direction. So if we're able to unpack countries into different layers, then we're able to understand, is it policy, an enabling environment they need to make the right policy, or is it capacity building that is needed within the ministry, or even an entire institutional restructuring that needs to happen. But again, then you go deeper into what is the private sector context like in the country, and what are the entry points in understanding how they can participate in the project. But I always say, let me be a little bit provocative. I actually think that most of the time, what we count as climate finance or blended finance is largely a combination of, blended finance coming outside, whether it's private capital outside or public capital coming outside. A lot of the government resources that are used for climate actions, they are not very documented. That's one. Number two, we need to also do better with what I call smart blended finance. Let me give you an example. If a country has a public resource, let's say from MDB, an allocation of $100 in a year, it is not smart to use $90 to finance one project and then probably get $10 from the country. You could use that $100 to probably put it into 4 different projects, 25, 30, depending, and then allow private capital to come in there. You can do more with 4 projects in 1 year than just 1 project. So it's still blended finance. The 90 is blending 10 in a way, but it's not the best use of that capital when you can use it as you can use 25 of it to blend in other instruments. Yeah. And for 1 project, another 20 or 30 to that. And in 1 year, you could do scale and speed. You can achieve scale and speed by having 4 good projects as opposed to just 1 that you finish that, you wait for another resources. Just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Yeah, there's, I'm hearing concentration issues all over your comments. I'm going to make an editorial comment, and then I'm going to leave each of you with while I'm making the comment with a final question, which I want to ask you to reflect back on our report and ask you what, if anything, surprised you about it. You know, we recorded an increase in activity. The entire increase in the field was in climate. There is, you know, most of that was from private sector parties. Anything about our report that surprised you or caught your attention that you'd like the audience to focus on? And in the meantime, my comment was just that you were talking just now, Dr. Sommer, about climate finance, and we do recognize that blended finance is a very, very small piece of climate finance. So climate blended finance is a very small chunk of the entire equation. There's a huge amount of activity that doesn't get captured by us. And you put your finger on one of the things that we are not adequately measuring as convergence, which is where are those blended deals where the concessional or the market moving piece of it came from a national government or a local government. We're unable to, where we stand now, to capture that. And I have a sense there's an awful lot of activity happening within countries that we don't see because it's very difficult to capture. And it's much easier to capture those transactions that involve a foreign party or a foreign donor. And so that's, you know, our view of the market is a partial view of the market. We recognize that. We still think that looking year on year, it's valuable information, but we do recognize that we are a small piece of it. Let me turn to each of you really quickly. We want to end in the next 4 minutes, and then I'll wrap us up with closing remarks. Guli, can I put you on the spot? What surprised you, your attention, or is meaningful to NDC partnership?
Yeah, I was very, very happy to see the reference to NDCs and linking NDCs to blended finance, to making, you know, climate implementation possible. And I think we are at NDC partnership very much look forward to continue working with, you know, with our partners and also with private sector to make those linkages, you know, between the work that we are doing on NDCs and all the great work that all of you are doing.
Thank you. Randy?
Yes, thank you so much, Joan. I think for me at least, what I don't know if it surprised me, but what I think is really valuable is showcasing how much the private sector actually increased in participation, because I do hear a lot around the place that like private sector needs to do more. And I'm not saying private sector doesn't need to do more, but I do think that your figure shows that private sector is trying to do more. Now, the right kind of investments do have to be there, because private sector does have fiduciary responsibilities to take care of. But like I do think that your figures show that we are trying, and we really do want to contribute in this space. So thank you.
Dr. Sommer, any comments? And you're allowed to tell us what wasn't in the report that we should have touched on too.
No, thank you. I had 2 points rushing to my head. Randy, you just took one of them out. Thank you very much for that. I think I was pleasantly surprised to see the increase in cross-cutting area. And I imagine that if we did this report 10, 15 years ago, that margin has been corresponding to reduction over time in mitigation. Mitigation used to be 80 to 90%. To come down to 50 to 65, it means that that space has been taken by cross-cutting. And the good thing about that is that we need to continue to push for an integrated approach. It shouldn't be either adaptation or mitigation. It should be both together, to the extent that, in fact, even if in the country, mitigation finance is easier to tap into, we should use mitigation finance to drive adaptation results. It shouldn't just be solar, renewable energy. It's renewable energy to drive agricultural production in semi-arid regions. It should be renewable energy to drive and power hospitals in climate vulnerable spaces. So it's very important to see that space expanding. And in my mind, I'm going to give that space to adaptation. So adaptation is moving closer to mitigation. But that's a brilliant piece of work. Thank you very much for your leadership on that.
Well, we really appreciate the feedback. Everybody reads the report and pulls out different things. What I was going to say in my closing remarks is that I am really happy to see a jump in activity. I do realize we have a long way to go. As somebody actually said in the Q&A chat, are you still telling me this is $8 billion or $18 billion of activity in a climate finance space that's in the hundreds of billions? Yes, we are talking about a very small proportion of the market. So in order to get us from where we are to where we have to go, I think one huge thing is collaboration. And it's a kind of a squishy word, but if you think about the people on this call, you have development bank, financial sector, and those working on the national level ecosystem, helping countries figure out their own national game plans. That's the kind of collaboration that's going to be needed in the blended finance world and the climate finance world more widely. So I do think we have a long way to go, and we're going to have to figure out how to bring unusual parties together to get things done, which is one definition of blended finance. I also want to remark on the growth in the market. It is characterized by some significant single data points. I'd love to see more of those data points. The point is not that small transactions in difficult aspects of finance are not valuable. They're hugely valuable. We need to experiment on the small end of the scale and then scale those things up as fast as possible so that we do many, many, many of those smaller things that need to be done too. So I don't want to say small is not beautiful. The significance of the large scale transactions is the ability for us as a market to replicate them and get the mainstream finance into them. So we have a long way to go. There's growth in the market. Let's see where it goes. It was all of the growth in the blended finance market this year that we're covering happened in climate. So all of the growth of the entire market happened in climate, and all of the growth in climate happened on the commercial end of the spectrum, or this commercial end of each transaction. So I'm thrilled to see that. We at Convergence are going to be working more on how to standardize the practice of blended finance so that you see recognizable transactions if you're a mainstream investor, so that if you're a donor, you know what appeals and where to work and what has worked. So we are all about making this field more repeatable, replicable, and standard. So off we go on this voyage, and we thank all of you for your real-world roles in getting that together, and we thank our audience for listening so faithfully for an hour and a half, and we hope everybody reads the report, comments on it, and tells us what is helpful and where we can improve. There's always more to do. So with that, I will close out on our 2024 State of Blended Finance Climate Edition and thank our panelists, Guli Sabahi, Dr. Somaran, and Randy Christensen very much for sharing your insights with us today. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.